It's been over 2 weeks now since the murder of George Floyd, and peaceful protests and hot riots alike have continued across the U.S. There have been growing calls by many protesters and congressmen alike to defund or even dismantle the police. Today on the Tonic Accord, we are going to cover all of the information on this. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm Alex, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Drew. Drew, what's up? How are you?
I'm doing all right, kind of stressful times for the entire world. So, that's happening. But other than that, I'm doing okay. I'm hanging in there.
Well, hanging in there is better than the contrary, I guess. And on a positive, we're both in the same time zone.
Yes, that's definitely a nice thing to have now, is being in the same time zone. Welcome back to the States, my friend. And yeah.
Other than that, yeah, what are your thoughts on defunding the police?
Right. So, at first, I think that I do kind of have the concern that the messaging of this idea is getting a little lost, and perhaps the wording could have been better from the start. Because from what I've seen is a lot of reactions from right wing media has said, this is a ridiculous call to abolish the police. I've seen funny memes about, what are you going to do when someone's robbing your house? Who are you going to call if you defund the police? And I think that there is a small minority that's trying to actually abolish all police officers. But I think the majority of people that are calling for change in these demonstrations are not talking about eliminating the police force completely. I think what it is maybe a question of, are we allocating the resources in the best way to have the best kind of policing, right? Are we perhaps training and providing the equipment in the best way for the best kind of community policing? So I think a lot of people are just calling into question what the current funding. But I do think that phrase, defund the police, scares a lot of people, and I understand why. And so, it is important that we dive into what that means. But I guess to start is, I understand people's concerns when they hear that and they get a little freaked out. And I think that I always want to remind the listeners that I don't think the majority of Americans want to completely abolish the police.
Right, and no, I think you nailed it. There is that there's definitely a messaging issue. I think kind of the right and the left are just talking over each other on this issue, and there's not a lot of conversation going on, because an overwhelming majority of both Republicans and Democrats support some form of police reform. But according to the New York Times, only 1 in 5 support defunding the police. And so I think there needs to be some common ground met, and there needs to be a better understanding of what's actually being discussed here, And
Right.
I personally don't enjoy or believe the term defund the police. And I'm kind of the person who thinks that two things can be true at once again, where I think that less police is not going to make places safer, but I think also maybe reforming the police department and maybe reallocating some of their roles. Because right now police officers are social workers, they're rehabilitation officers, they're investigating felonies, they're traffic cops. Like, it's a lot to do, and unless you're running them through training quite frequently and always having them prepared, always having them go through mental screenings, you're going to get some people that through either stress or just being a bad apple are going to do something bad, And so I do think that it's lost in the messaging, but from what I've been seeing, defund the police actually means put more money into different avenues of local and state governments that can help other programs inside of a community, like social services, welfare programs, etc. And I think that is actually not a bad idea, but I also don't think that taking money from the police department is also a good idea.
Yeah, I can get that, right? And I think you kind of hit it, like, other phrases we can maybe more accurately describe. I think a better approach would be like redefining what policing means, similar to what you said. We shouldn't have police having to do with, the mentally ill, right? I mean, we used to have a system, not that it was perfect. I'm not saying it was perfect, but we used to have a system for the mentally handicapped and the mentally ill. And a lot of those were actually defunded and shut down in the 80s. And now, today we see a massive problem in urban centers with the mentally ill that are also homeless. Well, now you have police that have to deal with mentally ill homeless people, and they're trained in a certain way to be very defensive. They treat everyone as if, the potential to have harm. And I don't think that's necessarily the right approach to the mentally ill. So that's one example of, like you said, police are kind of stretched thin and giving a lot of responsibilities that maybe we need to redefine. Policing should just be maybe a certain avenue and trained a certain way for that. And maybe things like mental health should be, funded by a different department and handled differently. I also think that the way we train our police officers is very different to those around the world, right? If you want to look at like some European states, Finland, Sweden, Norway, if you're a police officer, you have to go through a 3-year university-like police school, right? It's almost like a college, and they kind of view it as equivalent to a bachelor's degree. And in the United States, the average training for a police officer varies, but it's somewhere between 10 and 34 weeks, which is, again, not even a year, right? The max of the most for a regular patrol officer is like 34 weeks, which is 9 months. That's significantly less than the 3 years it takes to be a cop in Finland. And the kind of training is also very different too. I mean, in the United States, it's pretty much physical training. You do take a psychological test, and then you do those weeks where you learn like the laws as well as you can, and then you do, ride-alongs, and you go out into the field with other officers. 2 of the officers involved in George Floyd's murder were on their very preliminary ride-alongs with Derek Chauvin. So, it's a very different than a 3-year university course where you also get fieldwork, but you do ethics courses and conflict resolution courses. So I do think that, I agree with you. I don't think just taking away money from the police is something that will just solve this problem. I think it's a very complicated, nuanced issue. And I think one thing is we have to maybe consider increasing the training. If that means more money going to police, that's fine with me if it means better and more consistent training across the board.
Yes, definitely. I think that's the issue, is you have to kind of look at how defunding the police would be carried out, right? And I agree with you that I think we need to up a lot of aspects, such as training and continuous training as well, because I was listening to a podcast yesterday where they were talking about, even if officers are trained in hand-to-hand and psychological issues, etc., it's not frequent enough. So even if maybe you're mentally fine and prepared one week, say you experience an officer shooting or something along those matters, you could easily change or have issues that are never addressed. And I think that happens a lot of the time. Is sometimes you have cops that can deal with this post-traumatic stress well, but other times you kind of have these ticking time bombs. And when I saw the George Floyd murder, I didn't watch the whole thing because I just couldn't, honestly. But you saw a guy that clearly had something off about him. The fact that there's a man calling to his dead mother, and he seems completely, numb to the fact that this man is slowly losing life. And like you said, I almost can't completely fault the officers around him, because, like you said, they were in their first week of training, or not training, but field actual duty, and you have to kind of wonder, what would they do if their commanding officer and a veteran is doing this, and I think that goes back to the whole issue of there does need to be a complete redefining of what the roles of a police officer need to be and how much training and time needs to be put into it. And right now, I mean, it is one of the hardest jobs in society. So I think they should be dealt with training that does so. And that's a good point, and I just, well, today I'll ask you, right before we started recording, Trump did an executive order involving police reform. And I would say it's a pretty milquetoast executive order where it bans cases of chokeholds unless the officer's life is at risk. And it does want to create a national database, which I do think is a start. So at least the bad apple, But what do you think? Do you think that's enough, or he's just trying to calm the masses?
I mean, look, half a step forward is still half a step forward. I do think it's a good idea to ban chokeholds, right? Because it was not only George Floyd, but I'm blanking on the man's name now, so apologies. But there was the gentleman who was killed with a chokehold for selling loose cigarettes in New York. By the NY.
Eric Garner, right?
Eric Garner, right? Correct. And so we've seen multiple instances where chokeholds were pretty much not needed and led to someone dying. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a decent start. I don't think it's enough. I think we kind of touched on it a little bit when we talked about, these two officers that were new to the scene. And you said, they see a veteran, right? The veteran who they're along with on the ride along and they're training with. So he's their, basically their boss in that instance. He's the one carrying out this thing. They didn't feel, I don't know. I mean, I don't know their mind, but we now know they didn't speak up, right? So maybe that were scared to speak up about it, or they didn't, we don't know, but we do know that these guys were like, there's a culture, there's a pressure to not make the police look bad, right? It's, I think that's another huge issue, is this police culture where it's, you don't talk bad about the police, or else you don't get invited to the barbecues, you don't get invited to the cookouts, you don't want to report bad cops. I mean, look at what happened with Chris Dorner. Now, I'm not at all justifying his rampage he went on, but Chris Dorner was an LAPD officer that filed an official complaint after his partner beat a homeless man, and he was fired for filing the complaint. And in his manifesto, he talked about it. He said, they fired me for being a good cop. Right now, again, I do want to make it very clear. He snapped after that and went on a rampage that is obviously not good. But you still need to analyze the problem that, when people say, most cops are good, it's a few bad apples. Yeah, I believe that. I do believe most cops are good. But the problem is the good cops are not calling out the bad cops. The bad cops are being protected. Only now are we seeing a shift because of the public pressure to start prosecuting bad cops. But there's been so many examples. I have another example here. This is not even to do with Black Lives Matter. This was just another policing problem. In 2010, Auburn, Alabama Police Department started requiring ticket quotas. In a town of 50,000 people, they wanted 72,000 tickets a year, right? They called them contacts. The cop, Officer Justin Hanners, he filed complaints against his police chief saying, this is unethical, this is not good, these quotas are ridiculous, and it's not good policing. He was fired, right? This was a good cop that felt that the system was being corrupted by a new police chief, and he was fired for it. And so the problem is the good cops are not calling out bad cops. We're not getting rid of the bad apples. We're letting the bad apples stay on the tree. And that's a huge cultural problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point, and I think I mentioned it in our episode with Leah last week, where to me it feels like almost a fraternity kind of brotherhood issue, where why speak up when you want to kind of protect the institution that you're in? You know what I mean? It's this groupthink kind of ideology, and like that's what I keep seeing, especially in the Floyd one, where even if one of these officers could have done something, there's this idea of, well, if I then also will have issues, I'll face pressure from the union and the department, and it's not going to help anyone. And that's a serious issue that I think we need to, find a way to get out of. And there was actually an interesting NPR article I read from, I think it was back from 2018, but I think it's still relevant right now. And it talks about one of the reasons why these bad apples keep getting hired is because a lot of these suburban police departments especially just don't have enough funds. So do they either hire a new employee who's clean and asking for much higher wages, or someone maybe with 3 or 4 offenses who they can get on the cheap? Like they give the example of a suburb called Dolton, which is outside of Chicago. And police officers make fast food wages, so they make about, I think it was about $10.50 an hour, which is less than starting at Walmart. And so it's hard to find good cops when they're paying them less than a Walmart entry-level job. And so they basically say, well, we can get so-and-so, and he might have had some brutality issues or some character issues, but he's cheap. And and that seems to be an issue, is that it's sometimes hard to find good cops. And so my big question is, if all these funds are going to the police departments, where's the money going? You know, if they still can't pay the good cops to stay and get rid of the bad ones, and that's a problem that I think needs to be addressed. And you could probably point the finger at many factors, but I mean, when you see police showing up in almost militarized gear, and then you have these police unions that are just doing anything to defend their own, you have to think that the money's definitely going, but we need to get money going to better places inside of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's also worrisome, I mean, you have like military style armored personnel carriers, APCs, going through the streets of Minneapolis, of DC, of Los Angeles. And it makes you wonder, I mean, where is all this money going? And should we really be giving police military surplus gear? Because, it's almost like, I think it's actually a Finnish saying, but it's this saying that, when you yell at the forest, the forest will yell back. Basically all it means is to say is, what you come expecting is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it's this idea that if you are training up our police with military APCs, military gear, military weapons, they're going to act like the military. And then that means you have basically these soldiers viewing the American public as a battleground. That is not what it should be. There is a very big difference between what the military does, abroad in wartime, and what police officers need to do in our communities. It's a totally different context. But I do think that, and I don't think this is a Democratic or Republican issue. I'm sure many libertarians would agree that the militarization of the police has been increasing, right? And we get into even the more like dystopian stuff, like facial recognition and that kind of thing, and it's scary, right? I don't think it's necessarily a necessity for the police force to have large armored APCs. Now, I do still think that there needs to be a SWAT team that's ready for like an armed shooter, right? I'm not saying give our cops little squirt guns. What I'm saying is that they need to be, they need to have, again, a cultural shift from a more community-oriented policing where they're viewing our citizens as citizens, each other's as equals, right? Police need to view each other as equals and the populace as equals, and not like civvies, right? You'll hear that term a lot of military guys use is, civvies, right? Because you're a soldier and then they're a civilian, so they're a civvy. It's not like that with policing. It shouldn't be like that.
I totally agree. Yeah. And, I mean, just anecdotally, my time in Spain, I have noticed there's a different kind of relationship, I guess, between the police and the citizens. Now, albeit Spain has the Guardia Civil, which is the civil guard, which is basically like a police military hybrid, which was quite fascist. So they have their own problems, which I could get into that another time. But the local and national police, it does feel like it's more of a public or civil servant who is trying to respect the community and help people, right? It's less so of this kind of, okay, we're looking for something. We're looking for a problem. Like you said, we're screaming into the forest and kind of waiting for that echo. And I think one of the starts to this is trying to develop a better relationship between the community and the police. Because, I mean, one of the issues is you have a lot of police that don't even live in the places they're policing, right? So there's no strings attached between them and the community, which I think is important, because if you're living and working there, I think it does create a sense of transparency and accountability, right? You don't want to be harassing the citizens that then you have to go see at the coffee shop on your day off. So I think that's a start. And I've been seeing this going around. Like, I first heard them mention it on Bill Maher, but then Vice and NBC and the New York Times all had articles about this. And a lot of people are kind of saying, do we really need cops to enforce traffic laws? And I mean, obviously, we've seen a lot of cases, especially with African Americans, where a routine traffic stop can end up to be something much worse, right? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, prejudice, but also the fact that a lot of Americans have guns. So cops have to go in, potentially a little trigger happy and nervous. But there's a lot of routine stops that usually result in A, potential conflict between the police and the perpetrator, and second, unneeded fines and fees that might just put someone back into a cycle of poverty and more crimes.
Right.
And I mean, I think I've got 1 or 2 speeding tickets in my life, and both times have been from one of those traffic cameras, and so I don't know if we need police focused on some of these mundane topics that literally other forms of surveillance. You could have maybe even specific cops that are only meant to do traffic things. But I think if we start looking at historically the fact that cops weren't really designed to deal with some of these mundane issues, and I think one of the reasons why we see the African American community have a lot of issues with the police is just because of the amount of time there's contact between the two. And if we could remove one form of contact, which is just mundane traffic stops, maybe that's a start.
That's not a bad idea, right? I mean, and even if it's, or if it's maybe like the same people that do, parking tickets also do traffic stops and they're unarmed.
Right.
Because look, let's not, again, we can look at other countries comparatively. There are countries like France and in the UK, the average beat cop, the guy that's just on the street, walking around, making sure everything's good, and you can go up to him like, hey, I saw someone steal a blah, blah, blah. In the UK and France, they don't have a gun. They do have mace. They do have a nightstick, right? They have a flashlight, but they don't have a gun. I think that's important, right? I don't think that every officer needs to be armed to the teeth. Now, again, there does need to be an armed response for when things do get more serious, right? Shootouts, hostage situations. Obviously, you want to have the technology and the equipment available for those teams to be successful. I don't deny that at all. But I don't think the average police officer on the ground needs to have an AR-15 with an ACOG scope on it. I just don't believe that. And they do now. They have them in the trunk of their cars. Then they usually have a Glock or a Beretta pistol on their side. I think that you're right that the contact thing, if that can be lessened or computerized, that can maybe cause less friction. That's not a bad idea. But see, this is the conversation that needs to be had, and I don't think that the average American is having this conversation, and especially with a phrase like defund the police, and again, I've seen things like all cops are bastards. I don't see America coming together right now, like the left and right at least, to try and find solutions for this, and I see it becoming very politicized. And I see people just kind of blindly being, I support the cops, and without really looking at some of these major issues. As far as, and another interesting thing is what you said about, the smaller suburbs, right? Because police spending has been pretty steadily increasing over the last 30 years in major cities, right? Minneapolis, New York, Tucson, Los Angeles, to name a few. But crime has also been going down in the United States over the last 30 years. So you first hear that and you're like, oh, well, okay, the increase in police spending means the crime is also going down. A lot of researchers, this is based on the New York Times, don't necessarily think that's the case. They don't think there's actually a causation. And in fact, they think the increase in police spending is because a perception of the American public that crime is increasing. Crime has not been increasing. Crime has been decreasing the last 20 years. But if you ask Americans and they take polls, Americans believe that crime is increasing. And they're the ones that vote and then, vote for city councils that then approve police budgets. It's almost this weird, counteractive thing where, we're led to believe that crime is increasing when it's not, but then we're funding these police departments where maybe we don't really need to be in certain areas. And these large urban, Los Angeles, LAPD have such massive budgets, and then you have smaller departments that are in these podunk towns that don't have the funding to even pay good cops. So maybe you also have more of a statewide standardization of police departments. So it's not just left up to these small municipalities. Because again, when I mentioned Auburn, Alabama, that was a town of 50,000 people. One of the reasons they wanted to have ticket quotas is to get a higher budget and to get more money for their department. That's not a good reason, right? It's an unethical way to do it. But they had an issue with budgeting. So maybe we have to increase the standardization of these funding or whatever on a state level instead of on the county and the citywide level. But, that's tough. I'm not sure what exactly that looks like.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a pretty interesting point there, because like you said, I don't even know how you would start with that, but it's a true point, is that, you have these big city budgets just splurging on a lot of gear that A, they probably don't need, and B, just seems to kind of militarize their whole message. But then, yeah, you have these rural and suburban cops that are literally creating traffic issues just to try to, just to get a bigger budget. And I don't think that's correct. And probably a state look is what does need to be next. Before we get out of here, though, I did want to kind of turn to the political side of it just for a moment, just because there's a lot of things that have been kind of going through my head, just just over the last few weeks and everything. And I'm kind of worried that because this new protest movement after the killing of Floyd is moving so quickly, that people are going to miss some steps, and that's kind of part of my fear here, is that I think a lot of the people, because I have seen on social media, I think a lot of rational people don't want to get rid of the police, but I've seen a decent growing movement for people that actually do want to get rid of the police. And I'm just worried is that if you keep telling everyone that the police is just a racist system, it's going to just cause more resistance, and then it's going to cause even more police violence. And so I'm worried that we're going to get into this cycle right now, and I think we're seeing it currently. We're currently living it. Is that the more resistance, the more violence, and it's just kind of this cycle that needs to be broken, because giving the government the monopoly on force, I think, is one of the best creations of kind of modern liberalism. And I'm just worried that a lot of people don't understand that police forces are needed, but we need to restructure them. And honestly, if you're someone like myself who kind of says, I think that there's systematic issues, but we also need to look at the fact that we do need police, then you're just called, your opinion's not valid. And so I think this conversation does need to be had, but I just don't even know where it starts. And it worries me too, is because I almost think Trump could run on this message that Democrats don't want law and order. They want the breakdown of civil society.
He will. Yeah,
it could
he
really,
will.
I think it could help him. But it also worries me because I think it's going to incite a more authoritarian response from him.
Well, look, you have to remember that, things are happening very quickly, but things have not always moved this quickly. And there's been plenty of times where unarmed black people have been murdered in the street and no progress was made. I think it's, I would rather things maybe move quicker than most people are comfortable with than not move at all. There's a lot of things being said right now. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of voices that are very loud. I don't necessarily agree with the idea of abolishing police forces, but I do think that it is time to really reflect, and we do need to do that, and it's gonna be uncomfortable for people. It's gonna be uncomfortable for a lot of people to kind of reflect on these serious issues we've had in the United States for a long time. And so, things are moving really quickly, but again, that cycle, right? That resistance, then the violence. Let's not forget, people were protesting police brutality, and they were met with police brutality. That is the actions of the police. So, you have to put the blame where the blame lies. And so, I don't know. I hear you. Believe me, I hear you. And it's crazy times. But I'd rather things move quickly than not at all.
Absolutely. And I think we have, if you watch the news, you wouldn't know it. But I think we have seen both sides are at least working on bills and forms of reform that I think in the long term will probably lead to some form of good compromise.
Right.
It's just everything is just so new and so fresh and just so emotional and realistic right now. And I guess my just biggest fear is that because everything is happening so quickly and everyone's so angry, that while there's a lot of racism in this country and a lot of systematic issues, I'm just worried that eventually we're just going to start looking for racism's ghosts. And I don't know. I just think that someone needs to say, okay, the protesting is great, and I think it's inspiring a lot of good change. But also we need to take a look in the mirror and say, what is the next step? And I think we've talked about it, trying to get a better relationship between the community, trying to restructure budgets so it actually goes where change needs to happen, and just, putting more money into social services and other resources that help the cops not do everything, I guess.
And when it's starting to happen, Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles has already said he's going to reallocate funds to, mental health institutions, education. They're lowering the LAPD's budget. They're not abolishing it, right? They're not getting rid of the LAPD. I don't think that will ever happen, but they are doing some things. And so, again, we also always have to remember that the most radical voices are often the loudest. And so, that's what we'll see on the news because it's shocking. But I think, again, the majority of people are calling for reforms that are more reasonable, and it's working. I think that's another important point, is these protests are working. There is change happening because of the protests. And, that is what America is about. That is our history, is when times of strife turn into times of progress. And we're living through it. So, it's a good reminder that, there's a lot of things going on. And of course, no idea is going to be perfect. But things are working and things are changing. And I think most of it is for the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think I have too much more to add. I mean, we could talk for hours on this,
Sure.
about the whole issue. But you're right. Things are changing, and I think there will be positives to see out of this. Hindsight will obviously be 2020, and I think like we talked about last week, is that when we look back, will it be the crazy side of it or the actual legislative changes? And I think you're right. I think we're going to see that. So now, obviously, I do worry that if somehow Trump gets reelected, I don't know, things could be much different. So yeah, we're just going to have to wait and see. But I don't know. Do you have any last thoughts?
No, I mean, obviously Trump will definitely try and play the law and order card for his presidency, but we all knew that was coming anyway. I credit where credit's due. I do agree with his executive order. I don't think it really actually does much, but at least it's something, I guess. So, hopefully we just keep going.
Completely. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. What do you think? Should we just take it all down and start from new with the police, or should we look on redefining what that role means? Please let us know, and we'll be back later this week with other episodes. And as always, you can find us on YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and more. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.